Sadly, it is a common story among human beings, that of revenge. In Nîmes, France, there lived a shoemaker called Pierre Picot. No, I've not heard of him either, but his story may seem familiar to you. In 1807, Picot was set to marry a rather wealthy woman. Sounds pretty good, right? Well, unfortunately, not for Picot, as his supposed friends, three gentlemen called Lopin, Solari, and Chaubard, were riddled with jealousy, and they conspired against Picot and his matrimonial ambitions. A fourth friend, a chap called Alut, was aware of this ongoing conspiracy against Picot but did absolutely nothing to stop it. The so-called friends had Picot falsely accused of treason by saying he was a secret agent in the employ of the dreaded English. Though I do not know what evidence they presented the authorities with regarding this, perhaps only their words were good enough. Poor old Picot found himself locked up and imprisoned for the next 7 years in the fortress Fenestrelle. I'm sure this is really starting to sound familiar to you by now, and you probably know already where I'm going with this. It took 2 years before Picot even found out the reason for his imprisonment, and that must have been pretty horrific. All that time wondering, why on earth he was in prison, not finding out till 2 years later. That's horrible. Still, during this time, Picot was not idle. And while he was in the fortress, in his cell, he was able to grind out a small tunnel that took him into the neighboring cell. And it was occupied by, yes, you guessed it, an Italian cleric. Fancy that, The name of this cleric was Father Torri, and the two became very close. Unfortunately, Torri died, and when he died, he left Picot as his sole heir, with a rather sizable fortune. Picot actually didn't escape from the fortress. Instead, he found himself released when Napoleon's imperial government fell in 1814. And what do you think he did next? Well, you're probably absolutely right. He set about getting the fortune that Father Torri left to him, and then he plotted his revenge against Lopin, Solari, and Chaubard. Chaubard was the first to feel Picot's wrath, as he was murdered, either by Picot himself or perhaps by a hired hand or assassin. Whilst he was in prison, in fact 2 years into Picot's prison sentence, his erstwhile fiancée, the wealthy woman we mentioned at the beginning, married Lopin. So, Picot was determined to save his most brutal revenge for him and, unfortunately, his offspring. Somehow, and I'm sorry, history didn't record how, he tricked Lopin's daughter into marrying a criminal, who he then had arrested. The daughter apparently was so shocked by this that she collapsed and died. He then also had Lopin's son framed for a crime. The crime in question was theft, and he was then sent off to prison. Next, he had Lopin's restaurant, because I believe Lopin was a restaurateur. He had Lopin's restaurant burned down, forcing Lopin into penury. And poverty, of course, is terrible at any time, but I would imagine in the early 19th century France, it was pretty terrible indeed. Before he delivered the coup de grace to Lopin, he actually went about poisoning the other conspirator, Solari, and then he culminated his revenge by stabbing Lopin to death. So it's a pretty brutal story, isn't it, by now? And as I say, you probably guess where this is going. In a rather strange twist, though, that fourth friend, who was involved only by association with the conspiracy, Alut, remember him? I talked about him at the beginning. Well, he actually ended up kidnapping Picot and very seriously injuring him whilst holding him captive. The French police found Picot very badly injured in a terrible state, and before he died of his wounds, he told them the story of his remarkable quest for revenge and the murders he committed. The police, of course, were not alone in hearing this story. Another person also became aware of this story, and as you probably guessed by now, that person was Alexandre Dumas, and this story inspired one of his most famous works. And of course, that work is The Count of Monte Cristo. So, welcome to Beyond the Book, a new segment from Book Time with Elvis, with me, Mark. I'm sure many of you have read Dumas's Count of Monte Cristo, and if you haven't, you definitely should. I wonder how many of you actually knew it was based on a true story. I certainly didn't until I researched this. In this series, I want to look at the stories and such that surround some of our most favourite works and share them with you. So, where did the title of the book come from? According to legend, Dumas was on a boat trip. He was on a boat trip with Prince Louis Napoleon, who was the nephew of his more famous namesake. They were sailing around the Tuscan coast and they visited Elba in 1841, and whilst on that trip they passed by the Isle of Monte Cristo. Obviously the name was very intriguing. I mean, it does have a kind of mysterious air to it, and I suppose Dumas kept it in his pocket or in his brain, and he pulled it out, of course, when he was writing this masterwork and stuck it straight in there in the title. And I don't know how many of you knew that Monte Cristo is indeed a real place. In fact, it's a nature reserve, and it's very difficult to get there. There's a 3-year waiting list for permission to land there, and they have a cap on the number of visitors of 1,000 visitors per year. And just in case you're tempted, digging for treasure there is strictly prohibited. The book, like many books that we have now, was not actually released as a book upon completion. It was serialized, and it was first serialized in the Journal des Débats. And of course, as you can tell by the size of this book, it is a big book indeed. The serialization wasn't a quick one. It actually took 2 years for the work to be completed in the serialized form. And also another thing I didn't know, that in many early editions, the title was incorrectly spelt. It was The Count of Monte Cristo, but Cristo was spelled C-H-R-I-S-T-O, whereas of course we know the correct spelling is C-R-I-S-T-O, without the H. So I imagine, of course, those early editions with the spelling mistake probably are extremely valuable. The book has been translated into a plethora of different languages, but did you know that one of the first English translations of this work was done by Emma Lavinia Gifford? You know her, don't you? Well, if you don't, she was the wife of Thomas Hardy. Fancy that. The book has also gone on to inspire countless retellings and adaptations for both stage, screen, and radio. Lew Wallace used The Count of Monte Cristo as part of the basis for his work Ben-Hur. Stephen Fry has done a modern retelling in his novel The Stars Tennis Balls. It has also gone on to inspire Japanese manga comics you can read, detailing the story of The Count of Monte Cristo in various different versions. There are over 40 screen adaptations, including the 1922 silent film starring John Gilbert, which you can watch for free on YouTube. I'll leave the link down below. There's even a wonderful Orson Welles production for the radio, for his Mercury group, which you can also listen online for free. Again, the link will be below. The story even inspired a brand of cigars and a sandwich. There we go. So, thank you so much for watching Beyond the Book. I hope you enjoyed it. It's just something new I'm trialing on this channel, and I want to try and be as interesting as possible. So yeah, I'll see you all next time. Do take care, everybody. All the best. Bye bye.